It's lovely to be here and be introduced by Stephen, who I can tell you, he was a student who made you up your game when you were a tutor. So Stephen was one of the brightest students of his generation in the Bartlett. And he mentioned intuition. So, I was a very intuitive teacher. I always have tried to be, but it was, I know a bit more now than I knew then, of course. But, back then the studio was very much based on intuition. And Stephen's questions were always dead sharp. It took us, split us open, in terms of, what we were trying to do. So listen, this talk is going to be non-linear. I'm not going to take you on a really neat journey where it's going to work as a perfect story with a beginning, middle, and end, and ta-da. It's going to be a whole set of pathways which are going to go back and forth, and ultimately, it's just about talking about where I am at the moment in my work. And that's one of the reasons for having this image on the screen, which I'll come back to in a moment. But the incredulity of St. Thomas, plenty of people painted it. This one just by Caravaggio. This is not going to be an art history lecture. I'm the least qualified person in the world to give an art history lecture. But I'm just using it as a reference image in the context of the talk, because part of what I am going to be talking about is doubt and incredulity. In fact, we very nearly named the unit Incredulous Architecture last year, which I still might do someday, okay? But the talk's going to be called Design Through Production. And just to get us warmed up, I want to lay down a few kind of markers in terms of positions I've arrived at in where I fit in, where I think the architect that I'm interested in being fits in. So this is a drawing that was given to me one day by another architect after I qualified and set up a workshop with Nick Callicott, my teaching partner, who both of us were very, very lucky to have Stephen as a student in the early days of the studio. We were known for making things, and people asked us to make their work. Now, that was not something which I anticipated as a student going into the world of making things, and I never really stopped to think I could end up just making other people's work and not having any authorship of my own in it. So do you turn that kind of work down? And this was the table that we made from that sketch. And this is going back a long time now. This is 1994, something like that. But the point about these two images is there was absolutely no dialogue between the first sketch and the second table. So Neil Spiller, who gave us the sketch, and as you can see, it nearly burst into flames because he knows nothing about workshops. And he walked in, and we had just been working in the welding area, and he said, "I've got a great sketch," and he puts it down on a bench that we had just been working on with hot metal, and the whole drawing nearly disappeared. So we salvaged the drawing and had a laugh, and then we said, "Okay, yeah, what is it?" He said, "It's a table, and the drawing is 1 to 20," and that was all he said. So we made the table. But the point isn't about the fact we made the table, is that after we made the table, Neil then went on and made a whole load of other drawings about that table. And the point I want to make is that was a critical time for me in understanding that architecture, the architect, the author, the maker, the person who makes the drawing, the person who makes the things, everything travels from one to the other. The idea, it just happens to reside at one point in a sketch. It happens to reside at one point in an artifact. It happens to move out of that into other drawings. It'll come back into objects at a later stage. There's no point at which, for me, something is completely and utterly resolved in our work, I should say. I'm not generalizing other people's work. In our work, it's always this open question. And I think that's perhaps prompted by some of the three excellent questions I was asked. I did a little interview before this lecture here a moment ago. I was interviewed by some first-year students who asked three excellent questions, and one of them is well, they're all in the back of my mind in the nature of this talk. How does the work fit into the bigger scheme of things? Well, that's just the first point. The actual projects I'm going to talk about at various different speeds in this talk this evening are these projects. The first one is a drawn project called Perform. I'll explain what that is a bit later. The second one is this shelter called 5502, which was built, manufactured here in Germany, in Blankenberg, for a site in the north of England. I'll talk about that in a moment. and another much more messier one, which is an event that took place called the scan. And I'm going to move between these three projects tonight and talk about this notion of incredulity. So just to lay down a couple of other reference points, I mentioned Nick wrote a book back in 1999, 2000, one of the first books, if not the first book in the UK, certainly on computer-aided manufacturing and architecture. Everyone's making stuff now. Everyone's talking about digital fabrication. But Nick was one of the pioneers in design. Of course, anyone here in the room that knows anything about CAD/CAM will know it goes back to the 1950s. And it was in industry and engineering a lot longer than it was in architecture and in construction industry. And the very obvious reasons for that is our industry is fragmented into thousands of tiny parts. There's no way in which our industry gets shaped like the aeronautics industry or the automobile industry, where you can invest in one particular method. So it takes a long time sometimes for stuff to hit the design world, tools to hit the design world. But when they do, it's quite exciting to see what happens. So that's the first thing. Then I wrote a few ADs, which I'm putting them out there because they are steps. The first one I came out in 2004, Design Through Making, and that was very much a book about the period when Stephen was a student in our unit. In 2008, another one came out about proto-architecture, which was this, Design Through Making was just about this idea of walking into a workshop as a designer without a fully resolved idea in your head about what you're going to do, and regarding making as being of equal status to sketching or drawing, just figuring things out. Obviously, it takes a degree of risk or confidence or stupidity to do that. But I think that's the first motivation, is to see making as something as fluid and as open as design or through drawing. Proto-architecture was this idea of saying, architects who are interested in the world of making things have the opportunity to open up and develop different types of architecture, proto-architectures, architectures that aren't fully resolved. They're prototypes, they're proofs of concept, and they provoke our industry to think differently. And Manufacturing the Bespoke was a more resolved, thicker book about how that whole world moved on in and around 2012, around the relationship we have with industry as designers. And then more recently, this book called Zero Tolerance in Design and Production, High Definition, is going to pick up on some of the themes of this evening, which is the world we live in today, where the boundaries between the artifact, the design, and means by which we translate from those two worlds to one another is getting more and more precise in terms of its measurement. And leaving aside whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a thing. It's out there that we can now start to align things. There's a fantastic book called Translations from Drawings to Buildings by Robin Evans. If anyone hasn't heard of it, I recommend you read it. It's got to be one of the top 10 books on architecture on the planet. It's an amazing book. And I'm still influenced by that book, but in a very different way than the time when Robin Evans wrote it. He didn't know anything about digital fabrication at the time. So I look at things like this, which is a drawing by Saarinen and Saarinen's office, and I look at buildings like this and realize this was built the year that I was born, all by hand. So the drawings that made this building and the things that went into this building were all drawn by hand. And this is very much the world which kind of I envisioned myself becoming part of when I was a kid, thinking about being an architect. And I'm absolutely gobsmacked, amazed. I don't know how the word gobsmacked translates into German, but just to think that, if you look at the work of Zaha Hadid's office right now, the forms coming out of that office are not too dissimilar to these forms. And the technologies they're using to make them, we're barely getting our heads around and what to get out of them. And yet these forms were built in the mid-60s by hand. Making an entirely different point. But at the same time, I really admired the skill in that. This building by Toyo, a collaboration between Toyo Ito and Cecil Baumann, is regarded to be one of the first digitally fabricated scripted buildings. It was one of the Serpentine pavilions built in London around the turn of the millennium. I think it was just before the turn of the millennium. And it claimed to be this kind of great turning point in architecture, that an algorithmic script could be the source of the information that defines the design. And that is a conversation which has clearly gathered a lot of momentum, and there's a lot more that's been said about that now. But when I went to look at that building, this is what I saw. It was an analog-made building, pretending to be a digitally fabricated building. So to me, and I know they weren't making explicit claims that it was digitally fabricated, but when I think that's very interesting as a building to me. It was claiming to be one of the first digitally fabricated buildings, and yet actually it was analog. And I think there's an awful lot of stuff going on in architecture always between who's actually on the kind of money, so to speak, between the ideas that are going into the design and the ideas of how they might be made. And sometimes you're ahead of those things, sometimes you're ahead of them on design, or you're ahead of them on making. But I looked at that building and just saw huge mastic joints, square cut steel, all these things that were just part of a mass production industry. So I've always been interested in the relationship we as designers have with the tools that we use to make architecture. And of course, when I say that, we all know that architects don't make buildings. They make information that makes buildings. But the interesting thing is that simple little statement is getting harder and harder and harder to kind of keep contained now. That statement is kind of beginning to bleed apart. So these tools here are in the ORBA drawings collection in London. They're 2,500 years old. And because they're in the collection, they're Roman. It's implied that this is part of the lexicon of what architectural practice is about. Okay, so that's what's implied by having these tools in that collection. These are the tools that I had when I was a first-year student. So didn't really travel very far in 2,500 years, really, in terms of what we used ourselves to produce the things we produce, which is information for buildings to be made. But what's absolutely kind of revolutionary is what we have today. What we have today is a completely different tool set, which blurs the boundaries between the source of where the information comes from, how it travels into the world of production, how it comes out of that world into the world of prototyping, back into the world of production or design or whatever. It's this fluid set of loops. Within simple statements like file to factory came up to sort of imply we had this now jet stream world between design and fabrication. I think file to factory is an unhelpful term. I'm much more interested in the cycle. It's a continuous loop. And Phil Ayres, Dr. Phil Ayres, who's in the Royal Academy of Fine Art in Copenhagen, he's written a wonderful book called Perpetual Modeling. And I think it's a very nice idea to think that design is a perpetual form of modeling. We're constantly modeling. The building's a model, the design's a model, the prototype's a model, the next building is a model, and it's this perpetual process. I'm fascinated by the way in which the information we use to make representational tools like this is the same information we use to make the full-scale thing. So this is a structure designed between Tom Heatherwick and Ron Pachman, which failed, of course. It was called B of the Bang. There was a big row after it started to fail over who was to blame for the failures in it, and the manufacturer got the blame for using the wrong steel. But the thing that I like about this image is, looking ahead, I'm really intrigued as to who's that person in the middle of the image. Our relationship with industry is changing, and the type of people populating industry is changing. And one of the things that I think will come out of our discipline in the next couple of decades is that we will be inventing 21st century trades. We will be rethinking at a very different level how to educate and develop a population of professionals who can weld, who can do woodwork, who can run the script, who can do what Cecil Bauman does, who can do what Toyo Ito does, and who can organize the delivery of the project. I think there is a very big future ahead of us in this world between manufacturing and design. So I look upon these kind of worlds now. This is the factory where we made 5502, where Nick runs his business. As to me, it's like a huge drawing board. You know, particularly because of the digital age. I would have used that metaphor maybe 20 years ago as well, but it would have been a metaphor that it's like a drawing board. But I think actually now it is. If you think that everything that's in that image is digitally cut from a drawing file, there is this intrinsic relationship between the information that's made in the studio, wherever that studio may be, and the stuff that's on the floor, and the conversation that goes on between that stuff and those that put it together. So I think as architects, as designers, we have an intuitive understanding of that, appreciation of it, but I don't think we say it very clearly to the rest of the world. You know, we would go in there and go, yeah, I can figure out how that was designed and how it's been made. But actually, manufacturing doesn't really know very much about architects, and certainly doesn't think architects could, you know, naturally just fit into the world of manufacturing. But I have a feeling that we might be fitting in more easily in the future, in times to come. There's a couple of other things going on around us right now which kind of reinforce this through different streams. And one is La Machine, who are this theatre group based in Nantes in Brittany in France. And La Machine are known for like the big elephant that went down the center of London, the Sultan's elephant, the big spiders that were in Liverpool. I'm sure they've been around Europe as well. It comes out of the world of the street art, which is very, very strong in France, but also airborne art performance as well, where they use cranes and celestial kind of constellations and so on. But what I find really fascinating by going to the La Machine workshop is that it's in Nantes, it's on this island in the middle of the river, surrounded by the city. And you turn up in the morning, you get a cup of coffee in the cafe, you go out for a ride on the elephant. The elephant brings you back to this platform that you step off the elephant, and then you can see over the wall into the workshop. Then you go down the stairs, you go across to the museum, you see some drawings, and you just decide to buy a book, and you're buying the book, and you realize, hang on, it's the same person who sold me the coffee, who was driving the elephant, who was working in the workshop, and who was at the till in the shop when I was leaving. It was the same person. So what they've done in La Machine is that they've ostensibly present themselves as an organization of artists and street performers who also are makers, but they're making the process of making a performance too, which I think is inseparable as well from this conversation, is to move between these domains. And I love that. I think it's great. I think the other thing, of course, is things like motion capture, in which we impose one reality over another. I think that's something to think about. And then 3D scanning, which is something which has really preoccupied me in recent years as a provocation to this business of architects make information, they don't make buildings. So one of the questions that came up this afternoon before this talk was how do my students influence my work? Well, the first thing I should say is everything I do is collaborative, so I don't work on my own anyway in the first instance. So I work in a group called 16 Makers. That's what we were called when we started. We're not a practice. We're a group of people who come together for certain projects, which are predominantly now research projects. So this was the name we came up with when we were students. We stuck with it. But the point is we're collaborative. Not one of us really ever goes out there and claims solo authorship of anything. But Unit 23, which is the studio, I'm not teaching at the moment because of my new job at the school, but the unit has always been interested in design and the place of production. So we'll just run through a couple of short projects here just to give a bit of context, then I'll move on. But this one here is a project by a fifth-year student from Reykjavik, Birger Johnson. And Birger was interested, or he's known as Biggie. He did some research that revealed that we're losing our peripheral vision as a species. We're spending so much time in front of these things that we're becoming more foveally focused. And we're losing our peripheral vision. And there's some parts of the world where they're losing it much faster than others. So he took on this idea of how if we are, it isn't to say it can't be corrected, but if we are heading to a world where we're becoming less familiar with peripheral vision, which of course is the most powerful domain to register your position in space or threats from that are in the forest and all of that stuff. He's interested in how that might play out in how we might understand the design of space. So that was really intriguing. And he made loads of stuff which distorted our views of things. This piece by Madhav Kedar was addressing what I call saturated space. So I guess everyone in the room has got their phone with them tonight. Some of them are on, some of them are off, some of them are on silent. Some of you might have two phones, some of you might have a laptop with you as well. I don't want to connect to that. So Madhav was interested in this notion that we live in saturated space now. So we're receiving and communicating information and transmitting information about where we are, and that might be applied to different identities. So each of us in the room, clearly today with social media, passports and student ID cards, we carry loads of different identities and we play with that. I play into a certain identity and switch that one on in different spaces. So Madhav was interested in that and how that could be played out in environments of education. Tom Smith, unbelievable kind of skills as an animator, was interested in combining an interest in J.D. Ballard's book Crash and Concrete Island to explore very, very high definition animation. So this student spent an entire year working on a 5-second film of animation. That was his project for the end of the year. Tom Harvey was interested in notions of the vertiginous and played out in a whole series of experimental structures. The next one by Joseph Shaw was a critique of the BBC Natural History Unit. So the BBC has this very famous TV studio in Bristol in the west of England, where David Attenborough makes all these films about polar bears and so on, and they stitch it together to make it look like this incredible piece of natural filmmaking, but of course a lot of it's studio based, and they don't tell you that. They don't tell you that they've got the polar bears in a glass cage in the studio just to get the best shot. So Joseph said, well, let's go the other way. Let's call it the Unnatural History Unit and actually just make it extreme way of filming the natural world and building preposterous structures to capture the flight of a particular bird. And a lot of these are called clearly hypothetical scenarios. Waiting for Requiem was a project by Michelle Young, which was anticipating the return of the Hubble spacecraft to Earth as America's ultimate funeral, in a way. So this idea of Hubble spacecraft coming back to planet Earth as this procession and ending up in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. And then Jacob Down. Jacob's a professional surfer. So he's funded his education through surfing down in Cornwall, and as a result, he's a very physically orientated person. So he was interested in architectures that would take the body to physical extremes and made prototypes that would, put an awful lot of pressure upon the body in extreme positions. And then this project, which actually is the springboard to the rest of the talk in some ways, was a piece by Tom Slivens. He's a student who's half Canadian, half Lithuanian in the school. He now works for us as a teacher. And the Bradbury Building is this famous building in Los Angeles, which appears in Blade Runner and lots of other films. So as this physical artifact in a very ordinary world, if you're driving down, LA, you see the Bradbury Building and you go, that's the famous building from Blade Runner, And so this idea that a physical building is known as a prop more than as a physical building played on this idea of merging that with other projected realities. So he modeled the entire Bradbury Building in 3D and then through robotic arm camera movement, invented another film that existed within it. We take portraits of our students every year as well, which is something we do which starts to say, look, these are for the exhibition at the end of the year. The Bartlett School of Architecture Summer Show is a very famous show in London. About 10,000 people come to see it in a week. But there's very rarely a photograph of any students' faces in this show. And we like to sort of play upon this, but also make the point about it's a portrait taken in the place of production. So that just talks about the kind of the fiction and the fact that goes behind the work. So I'd love to spend more time on all the student work, but I'm going to come back to one project I did with them in collaboration. But before I do that, I'll just talk about one other thing, which is the Fabricate conference we ran in 2011. So this is a 3D scan of the conference itself, which I'll use it as I'll come back to explaining it a little bit more later on. But you can see the detail here already, that to capture an audience at an event like this over time gives you this, detail you can come back to at any point in the future and remodel. So one of the ideas of actually scanning the audience at the opening of Fabricate was to think about the next conference and the conference after. But what we noticed around the time of thinking about Fabricate is that there seemed to be this amazing kind of world emerging between experimental practices and universities or research institutes that are opening up slightly different paradigms of where they normally operate. So this is the Mediatek building in Barcelona by Cloud9, and Neil McLaughlin's Bridge, Jean Nouvel's Dome, Bollinger Grohmann Sphere, Loughborough University 3D concrete printing for Foster's, and the Galaxy Soho building in Beijing by Zaha Hadid. Each of these projects, which were emerging in the sort of between 2009 and 2011, for me were provoking opening up a different place for an architect to practice in. One might be procurement, another one would be about experimental forms of fabricating buildings or structures or relationships with industry or modeling. And then and they were all practitioners. Then if you look to the other side, and you see Achim Menges down in Stuttgart building his pavilions, Skylar Tibbets in Boston at MIT, Phil Ayres in Copenhagen, Peter Webb in London with the extruded clay, and Nat Shard, who's now at the Bartlett but was in Manitoba. A whole series of academics starting to break out of the world of, say, scholarly work or contained research into how design that experiments with fabrication can operate in an academic environment. So Fabricate became this successful conference, and we ran it 3 years later, last year in Zurich, and we're currently going to announce where it'll be for 2017. I'm just going to show you this little movie here as a taster, because it just adds another point to the number of points I want to make tonight. So all of you will know that you've seen schools of architecture around the world buying robots, and some of you would know why they're doing that, and other people might be asking why. The first thing I want to say is that getting a university to buy you a robot is the first trick. I mean, getting one and what you do with it is the next bit, but getting the university to actually buy you one in the first place took quite a big effort, because in a university like UCL, they look upon things like robots as tools for research. So the robotic arm has been around since the 1970s. And you just say, we need to buy one. They go, well, you're going to make a new one, or are you going to change robotic arms? What are you going to do to robotic arms? Or say, no, if you put a tool like that into the environment where designers are open to what it might be used for, it's a provocation. So in our engineering department, they couldn't dream of ever asking for a piece of equipment on the basis of that argument. The engineers would always have to say, the research question is this, and the tool we need to do one aspect of that research is this. Whereas we said, we don't know what we want to do, but we want this tool in there to shake the system up. Yeah? So this piece here, which is pure piece of demonstration, there's no research going on here particularly, as we were asked to demonstrate our skills in modeling. So the engineering department, who didn't have a robotic arm, because they couldn't think of a research question that could get one, yeah? They saw that we had one. They said, oh, well, we need to get a robotic arm. If you can show you can do this, then we can prove a research question. They scanned this bronze bust of Darwin, and we remodeled it in this polystyrene. And I'm sure the visually astute amongst you will notice that this film is also being made by a camera on the end of a robotic arm. So this little film here is demonstrating a few things. One, the architectural workshop has got its head around some high technology like using robots, and no one got killed. But number two, yeah, you know, we understood the journey a design makes into the world of production and becomes a set of tool paths. So the tool path translation is an interesting one. And if you really know what you're doing in that world, you can start to play with tool paths just like a craftsman would play with a tool to shape a piece of material. You can decide to what extent the tool path ought to be revealed in the work and demonstrate things. And then you can make the film, which of course can tag to kind of geometric positions that are keyed into the work that talks about space away from the artifact. So I put it out in there just to say that workshops have changed an awful lot since Stephen was a student in the Bartlett. And they're changing everywhere, not just to the Bartlett. So back to these three projects I want to talk about. 5502, which was made in this factory in Blankenberg. I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail. I've talked about it before, and there's a book about it that you can read if you wish. But one of the main things about this project, some of you might know, is that it was made on the fly. We didn't fully describe the design before it started to be made. In fact, the interesting thing about this image here is the model on the left was made after the object on the right. The object on the right was the first thing we did. And then the digital information for that was sent into the model workshop to make a representational model to show the client, going, this is what the structure we're thinking a building might look like. If we had shown them the photograph of the one-to-one thing, they might say, well, you're going ahead and you're making it. What are you doing? You haven't shown us the design yet. So we kind of flipped things around backwards, did loads of sketching. The object there in the top right-hand corner was an exam. So Nick has 45 employees from time to time. It moves between 30 and 45. And we were very keen that only one or the very most two steel fabricators worked on this project throughout the entire time we did it. So we invented this object. It has no meaning. It's technically quite difficult to make. We asked anyone who was interested in joining us in this project to make this object, and then we picked them on the basis of their results. Nick, being a very clever designer and manager, he picked the best welder, but not the second best welder as well. He picked the best welder to know he'd get some great welds, but he also picked the most experienced member of staff to oversee the entire process. But he's putting experience together with real sharpness. And as this image implies, the building was built as you might build a model. It was built at full scale, one-to-one. How we won the competition is a long story, but we were taken on board as the wild card. They asked for pavilions to be built in this forest, and we said, well, we'll go about it a certain way. We're not going to tell you what it's going to be. This is the way we're going to go about it, and that's going to be the story of the project. But the project took a really interesting twist when a year later, two students of mine who had got to grips with 3D scanning went up to Kielder to scan it. So if you take on board the point that I've made, is that this building had no fully resolved design model before it was completed. The design model was incomplete. A 3D scan of it, therefore, is the only complete kind of digital capture of the artifact itself. Now, apart from the fact that it produces visually kind of tasty images and so on, that was a really interesting kind of moment of pennies dropping, so to speak, that, you can design something which is in a way that we're familiar with because we've been doing it for about 20 years, with making and so on, but not have to worry about matching the design. But then you can scan it and make comparisons back through the chain of what's different to what got built, to what got designed, and seeing the difference between the two. Now, this is where we're getting into the kind of conversation about zero tolerance, is that there is zero tolerance in this model, because it's obviously it's a 3D capture of what was built. But if you overlay that on the design, which I'll show you in a moment, it raises interesting questions about translations from making to artifacts. So that's Nick's name, if everyone are going to see him. Now, running concurrently to this, we were invited to do a project for the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in North London. So this is a very, very small, it's not an independent drama school. I think Laurence Olivier went there with some very famous actors. It's in Swiss Cottage in North London. It's there. And there's some trees, and there's another theatre. And this is the Central School of Speech and Drama, and this is the Hampstead Theatre. And they face each other across this road in this very posh suburb of London. One is a school and one is a commercial theatre. Both of them, of course, have auditoria, but one of them has rehearsal rooms and workshops that students and visitors get to use for events in themselves, and the other has public cafes and with cappuccinos and flat whites and things. And the organization on the right-hand side came to me one summer and said, would your students like to build a temporary structure in this space here for a conference called Theatre Materials? And the budget is about £10,000. We need it up by sort of late November. They could just do it as a really simple project, have some fun, because everyone thinks architectural students need to learn how to build things, so they feel they're doing good, giving them the chance to build things. And I, not knowing where that was going to go, I said, yes, that's really good. Let's take that on and see where we go. The space that they asked us to build it in, we discovered later, was also used for performance a lot of the time. And this, of course, the minute you get these two worlds together, students will, they'll always go off script, which is the great thing about students. So the Bartlett students go off script. You ask them to do one thing, and that's the last thing they're going to do. They're going to do something else. And what they did was they came back to the very first presentation that for the Central School of Speech and Drama, and they all came back with all sorts of different ideas, which we'll go through now in a moment. So James Barrington came back with this idea of this kind of Roman, almost these Roman chariots that could be wheeled out, and you could have an outdoor kind of gathering space for performance or talks or whatever. So he liked that idea. Frank Gilks, who was, he's a real Diller Scorfidio fan, he was interested in this hinge space, which would have a mirror in the center, which the two spaces of the theatre could face each other, or they could be hinged. And this would be another way of challenging this notion of a temporary space that itself would challenge the conventions of theatre. Justin Goodyear was interested in parametrics, so he did this malleable skin structure. Rick Lipson, who has a lot of experience in theatre, he worked in Stewfish, which is the studio that does, led by Mark Fisher, who's now no longer with us, sadly. But they built all the stadia for the Rolling Stones and U2 and all of those other big bands. He did this very vertical theatre. Matt Shaw did this floppy space that you could, pull into shape with articulated arms. Katrina Varian did this piece called Parasite Performances, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. But her idea was to attach kind of parasites to the building and make new theatre spaces. This was kind of perhaps closest to what they kind of were talking about in the brief. And instead of building it, when they saw those ideas, to their credit, the Royal School said, okay, forget it. These ideas are far more interesting to develop than to have this thing, spending £10,000 on scaffolding poles and plastic. They gave us the money to push those projects and exhibit them as ideas. So they just squashed into the building anyway and gave us the entire budget, which was meant to give them extra space for a vitrine to exhibit the ideas. And that reinforces the power of ideas to kind of turn a client 180 degrees and say, we're not going to do what we said we're going to do because your ideas are more interesting. About a year later, we managed to get quite a lot more funding for this project, and I was allowed to hire one of those students to work with me for a year. And we went back to the brief, and we devised a new set of requirements. And in conversation with the client again, the things that they liked about those projects were mobility, other forms of use, adaptability, the bareness of things, the kind of rawness of things. There was no need for a blackout, which is a real convention in theatre, like we have here now tonight. Not an absolute requirement. It needed to demonstrate some of innovative technical provision. They liked the idea that the making of a theatre could be a theatrical idea in itself. So if you're thinking about La Machine. And then also to produce something which was clearly about the research potential of these two organizations. We're not commercial theatre. They weren't, and we're not a commercial practice. So with Matt Shaw on board, we went about a whole new design process and designed the Perform project, which we decided to take as a starting point, a standard articulated trailer as the base for everything else to be designed around. So Matt developed a whole series of configurations of how that articulated trailer could be used for different types of theatrical performance. He made physical models, part digital, part analog. He played with some of those models. This is a really nice idea for how the articulated truck could open up a structure. So if you if you're driving along and you're pulling a trailer behind you, and the articulated truck could put the brakes on the trailer and then pull the structure apart. We had also just got our SLS printer at the time, so Matt was very keen to use that. The other little thing we did, which was we heard we were going to meet, we were very short of money, we heard we were going to meet one of the funders, sponsors of the Formula One team, the Williams Formula One team. And we heard this guy has got no time at all for email. He's got no time at all for presentations. He doesn't do boardrooms. When you meet him, you get 1 minute and that's it. So we made a flip book, which we thought he could put in his pocket. And this demonstrated the idea of the project in less than a minute. So this was a flip book that just went bang. And this was how, on the other side, it was showing how that was a relationship between performance. So we did capture his attention, and we got a little bit more money, not a huge amount. But I just share that one with you. If next time you're meeting the leader of a Formula One team, you've only got a minute. So the 3D scanner came in at that point, and Matthew organized laying out the first sketch of this proposal at 1-to-1 in a park not very far away from the theatre. And the students from the school came over and they walked around the plan. We used ropes from the fly tower to mark the plan out at 1-to-1. And they walked around the plan, and actually everyone agreed it was way too big. So we started to squeeze it down. Matthew then started to make some really interesting models, which were all articulated to show how it would expand. You could move along the motorway, as a compact sort of Swiss Army knife, and then arrive in a space and open up and become this performance space. So we did lots of that. I don't want to dwell on this too much because we're going to turn a corner on this project in a second. So that project ended up described in this fashion as a platform with an armature that would support a skin overhead, and all the parts would be inside the box as it's moving. This is a way of describing it in situ we had a 3D scan of the quadrangle of the university, and we were demonstrating how this piece could be read in a real-time environment. So now the problem with that project is that's where it ended. And you see, this is really where we wanted to get to. We wanted to build something, and that project ended up as a design, which was something that always frustrated us. And going back to the potential that we had exercised in this project, this is the sort of stuff that Nick makes every day. We felt that although that design had many kind of rich possibilities, it had not engaged with the world of making or manufacturing to the extent that this project had. So we were kind of thinking about this when another opportunity came along to do one final chapter of that project, just as these images of 5502 were coming together. And one of the things was, after we scanned the 5502 project, we started to analyze the differences between the CAD model and the 3D scan. And where this model is really, really red, those two models line up. Where it's white, they don't line up at all. It's clearer in this image here. Now, we're not identifying a fault here. If this was the wing of a Boeing, airplane or an Airbus A380, yes, serious problems. But it's interesting that we were starting to identify difference. Okay. So we decided to go back and think about the Perform project in an entirely different way. And some of the things which at the back of our minds were the ways in which the physical produces other results that the digital can't. So when you're rolling or folding steel, for example, it has a spring in it that, getting it to actually come to the exact curve every time with every single piece of steel, all of which are different, is a fascinating task. Mixing medieval techniques of forging with digital techniques of cutting. So the project which we went on to do, which is the final thing I want to talk about, is called the scan. And it, in many ways, this project here reassures me I'm an architect. Okay, so it's stuff. I can go up and I can knock it. I designed it. It was built. It's in the forest in the north of England. It got an award. It's in magazines. I get phone calls from my auntie. It goes, congratulations. Always wondered what you were going to do. That kind of reassures you you're an architect. You've built something. But those 3D scans were kind of spooky. They were raising all sorts of other questions. So the event that we ran ended up in this moment here, which was the space behind the stage of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, with a saturation of 8 projected films hitting the audience simultaneously. And the organization we worked with are called Shunt. And this is Shunt. Louise Ma and Hannah Ringham. Now, Shunt are known in London for the organization that ran Tropicana under the London Bridge railway station for about 10 years. It's a huge performance event. They ran a very interesting performance in Hackney called Dance Bear Dance, where it was 2 adjacent archways underneath the railway track, where there were 2 completely synchronized parallel performances going on at the same time for 2 different audiences that didn't know that was happening. So they play an awful lot with space and expectations and disruption. They're very subversive in they're maverick and subversive. So I really wanted to get them involved. The project that we decided to go back to was Katrina Varian's project, and say, look, out of all of them, hers was actually perhaps the clearest response to the brief. Is like, how do you transform a building with kind of almost minimal amounts of extra architecture to invert its status? So we're very interested in her ideas there. So when we realized we had to scan the whole building to think about that, we opened up the invitation to Shunt to disrupt the scanning process. And well, if I'd known what was going to happen when I said that, I might have been a bit better prepared. But, we really wanted to go into this as a sort of an open, free-fall collaboration. So Shant went, OK, so you want us to disrupt the scanning. This is fine. We can do that. So what they did was, as we were picking out spaces, this is one space we felt would be very, very powerful. It's the very top of the building there, which is a practice room. This is this space where Katrina's project was. It's hard to read at the moment because all the facades are stripped off, the gables taken away. But we're interested in this zone here, this room here, and this kind of fire escape there. We liked this room because it was so tall and open, but it was also the practice room. We liked this staircase because it was adjacent to that practice room and also split levels. And we liked this fire escape because it was, it was almost like this kind of exposed section of the side of a building. So as we were just doing the routine scan of the building, which took about 3 or 4 days, Shant disrupted it, and they carried out a series of performances. One was this scene here, where Hannah was just sitting in a chair and crying. Another scene here is where they drew out a chalk mark as if someone had been murdered, and these two figures were investigating it. And they had no introduction to 3D scanning before, but they got it instantaneously that it is just digital dust, So you can draw a line on the surface, and it has the same status as the metal stairs in a way, in terms of the point in the cloud. They then performed this act on the roof terrace of one of the spaces looking down into the courtyard, which if I'll have time, I'll read some pieces out from it. And then if you go back to the crying room, and you look at what we were, obviously, this is not a view we had of that room when we were doing the scan. It was only a view we had of the room when we were putting the model together. We were really fascinated by what happened there. This black circle here, of course, is where the tripod of the scanner is standing. So it can't scan beneath itself. It scans everything else, apart from that cone. So if you see the scanner is there, and there's a mirror here next to Hannah. And the scanner is moving around in a circle as a wave, like a radar. And it's picking up the reflection of Hannah in the mirror and then transposing it onto the other side. And that is the reflection of the scanner itself. Okay, there. So, we know this. This is what mirrors do, They're the other world, the other side of that wall. But, in a 3D scan, the stuff appears geometrically correct on the other side of that plane. So that immediately triggered a whole set of ideas around, well, perhaps the theatrical performance we could be creating is this incredulous space that we're using real space to project something into another space that you can't see. Intrigued by that, we went back to the workshop in the Bartlett, and we put a mirror on the end of a robotic arm, and we just let the robotic arm move very, very slowly, and we scanned it as it was moving. And we got this really weird, result, which is, the scanner moving in this kind of sweep, the robotic arm moving the mirror, and producing this completely undescribable kind of result. This is not material. This doesn't physically exist, but it has an architectonic quality. So now you might understand what I'm getting at with that kind of image there. So then, of course, I did what any smart academic would do. I picked the smartest student in the unit who had his head around Grasshopper and Rhino and all the rest. He can work at 1,000 times the speed I could, and great mathematician. And we said, well, if we populate this building with mirrors in very key positions, could we, create this array of these performances in this void that Katrina's project was in? So this is what Thomas did. He did a plan of the practice room, and we imagined a figure standing here, a scanner positioned there, a row of mirrors here, which are of diminishing proportions. He calculated the speed the scanner would move that would produce this array of reflections of this figure here. Okay, he's a clever guy, and So that is another way of describing that in 3D. He also looked at ways in which we could populate the stairwell with much smaller mirrors, which are positioned a bit like periscopes, who would project figures from one floor through a mirror out into that space again. So this is a way of describing this. It builds up over time, and then you'll see them all come together. This is the practice room with the array of figures there, and these are where you would be positioned as a result of the mirrors on the stairwell. And this is another more surveillance type space down here underneath the fire escape. And that's the world we were working with. So we went off and made these things. So this is the physical mirror sitting on a handrail on a fire escape. This is one of the big circular mirrors in the stairwell, and this is the array of mirrors in the practice room. Here they are again as these instruments on the stairwell, and they're all kind of millimeter perfect, and when you're setting them up, it's really interesting because you're back in the mind of thinking you're in the digital model, that you saw back in the studio, and these mirrors have to reflect the digital model. And then we install them with the view to rerun this entire event a second time round. So if you're staying with me now, we had this first scan, which was done actually in April. We made all those mirrors, we put them in place. Shunt went off and thought up a new script, and we ran the whole thing again live with an audience of 60 people. And we called it the scan. And we, of course, Hannah and Louise went off and they devised all sorts of other scripts within the event. And I'll just finish by showing you the film, one of the films that came out of that night. And I'll explain a little bit about what the evening was like. So the ticket said turn up at 6 o'clock. The audience of about 60 people turned up, and they were divided into 4 groups, and they were each taken to different parts of the building for 4 different performances. Some of those performances paired up to become a single performance, and the entire event, which took place over about an hour and a half, gathered as one single kind of act behind the main iron curtain of the stage. What the audience didn't know is that we'd done all this before. So I'm sure they worked it out to some extent, but it wasn't said. So we had scanners with us. We were scanning the audience. We were filming the audience. We were photographing the audience. The performances were happening, and they became scattered, and they came back to see them all together. One of the thing that happened in this process is that Hannah and Louise were able to now start stitching together as a collage the events that had taken place in the first scan. And it's captured, I think, quite successfully in this little passage here that they read out. And this is the text that they read out when they were in that circular performance at the top of the stairs. This is a summary of events. You are all here. We are walking in a circle together. You aren't here. You're jumping through walls and looking at yourself in the mirrors. In some, you look fatter. There is no circle. I'm walking between Philip and Michael. It's a cool evening. No, you're not. No, it isn't. Now I'm over here, and some of me is over there. Rubbish. We aren't here anymore on this roof. We are all together in the dark, sitting down. You can see us, but we left yesterday. We left last week. No, we left a year ago. The thing is, we left in September 27th, actually. We can see things you can't. It's not always helpful. I can see through that wall. It's not very interesting. Outside it's autumn. Soon it will be summer. I'm a different person now to what I was when the day of the scan you sat on your own all afternoon reading a book when you should have been with me. I'm in another room now. I am crying. You said hurtful things to me and you weren't sorry. Right now you are on a bus eating cake. The woman sitting next to you died 6 months ago. You are whispering to me something I can't quite understand. I am too embarrassed or uninterested to tell you. We are all fragments. Look, I have a cloak that makes me invisible. You have a sheet. No, it looks like a sheet, but you can't see me. You're standing behind a sheet. I am invisible. Let's stop walking. Save our energy. We're going to be walking in this circle forever. Our feet are now part of the building. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing, like my invisibility and the fact that I was crying. Come with us. It is time for the scan. There is no scan. You 10 will need to come with me for the scan. They're going to be scanned. And then and there was a lot more stuff they read out throughout the process. This final scene here is choreographed by ScanLab, the two students who did all the scanning with us, who've now formed this very successful visualization business. And they ran this film. This is the film from the April scan. And they ran a parallel version of a live scan that had been captured that evening. So on the screen, we had these 6 projections. And one of the kind of purposes of it all was to kind of throw the audience into this spiral of how to measure what had happened, when it had happened, what role the physical artifacts had, what role the straight photography had, what role the 3D scanning had, and to somehow start to open up a different conversation about our understanding of space and the role that architecture might have outside the world of the physical. I think I'll leave it there. So, thank you.
So would you like to take a few questions?
Sure, yeah. No, we didn't. The only things we built were the mirrors. Katrina came to the event, by the way. She was one of the first people on the guest list, naturally. But no, it was the only thing we built were the mirrors and the time it went to put the scan together, which that model took several weeks to assemble. Yeah.
What do you think is the percentage of like the work you showed you showed in your presentation right now, and like say like a basic education in your school? So what's the relation to it?
Well, this is a project which was developed as a research project with graduates or during the summer between their semesters, so to speak. So we weren't doing this project in the studio with them. What it means in terms of basic education, I think, I've always had a sort of very firm belief that, education shouldn't try to mimic practice, like it's pretending, everything it's doing is real. It's not real. It's a drawing or a model. You're not building it, but we go through this rehearsal process in education. Projects like this are there to provoke maybe a little bit about how we're approaching new technologies. So we're not claiming to have, invented scanning, obviously, but we're obviously exploring a different relationship with an experimental theatrical company about how we might understand space in a different way. So theatre of all the arts has not really resolved yet how it fits into digital space. So there are a number of mixed reality theatre groups who do things like you wear headphones and you go around a city on a bicycle and you listen to a performance, or that there are very, very, very particular performances you can only find by having sort of Wi-Fi connections to the transmitters and so on. So there's like geo kind of navigation of performance. But what this was trying to do was to open up a conversation around that moment in theatre, which we call the reveal. I don't know what the word might be in German, but every theatrical performance has this moment in it called the reveal, which is the entire point of the performance, where there's this switch between the world that took you up to that point and the world after that point. And what Shunts were interested in doing was almost having reveal run all the way through, is that it's constantly subverting itself in playing with notions of time, playing with the sequence of things, and playing with the order of events. I have to say, it was a chaotic evening, completely chaotic evening. It was taking part at the same time as a conference called Collisions, okay? And somebody hadn't really done their homework on the choreography in the school, and there were 2 or 3 performances happening at the same time. So when a group of people are at the top of the stairs and they start moving down, they get strung out quite quickly. Yeah? Well, that happened to one of our groups when they were at the top of the stairs. But none of us knew that one of the other performances that was going on was a burlesque performance. And they were in a theatre space that had a doorway to a landing halfway down that stair shaft. Okay? So our group, one of our groups split up and they went down the stairs. And then by just some extraordinary piece of coincidence, there was a gap. And in that gap, one of the performers from the burlesque piece comes out and stands on the landing, totally naked, in front of a mirror, okay, which is her mirror, not our mirror, okay. But our audience had seen the mirrors upstairs, and they thought, oh, mirror must be part of our performance. So, but she only had to come out for a couple of seconds to get her cue to go back in again. So she goes back in again, and our audience follow her in with their bags and rucksacks and cameras and everything. So, so the spell of that performance was kind of shattered by ours in a way. So Shunts were very, very happy with that. I don't think the burlesque performance were too happy about it. But so that was, and what this to me, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a linear lecture. I haven't resolved this project at all yet. These are like cuttings on the editor's floor, so to speak. There's stuff on the floor that we need to pull together in this project. We have hours and hours of video footage, which we haven't reviewed yet, and so on. But part of it is actually trying to examine a world, which architecture is perfectly legitimate position to engage with, is the notion of how space relates to scenography, relates to time, relates to physical prop making, relates to the capture of performances, and how those things can all play together in a different way. So we were very interested in how it could be quite explicit that you go to a performance and it's incomplete, and that you resolve how to complete it in another space in a different time. So that's where it got to. Very clear.
I have a question, maybe in terms of stuff back to students' point of view. How do students later on find the relevance between them, or how do their developments develop?
The relevance of this kind of work to theirs?
Yeah, I see that there's this distribution of information and technology through institution must be somehow very relevant to students later on works, and how do you view that?
Not everyone would agree with me. Not everyone would agree with me at all. But I just use that image there for a second. Is that I think we predominantly operate between these two images most of the time as architects. We make the stuff on the right-hand side in order for the stuff on the left-hand side to happen. But, in the past, we've always relied on all sorts of other people occupying the world in between. that translated that drawing for us. So sort of manufacturers or joiners or craftsmen or builders or engineers, all sorts of other layers were in there between the first drawing done by the designer and the final artifact. And one of the challenges facing us today is that with digital technologies, those two worlds are coming together very, very fast. And if you look at it in the world of the glass is half full, you'd say, well, that's great. The designer can move across now from the world of making representation to the world of making things and take ownership of the information all the way through and say, look, I'm still involved as the designer because I can tag that information at the very least, or I can be the person changing it. Or there is another view that says the designer could be pushed out, it could be pushed to a tiny amount of time at the very beginning, and another industry takes over, you know, and says, thank you very much, you've done your job. Now we know how to produce this stuff because all the systems are in place. So I think the relevance, I would say, of the projects that we are trying to do within tiny budgets are stretching the kind of the skill set of the designer, but also stretching the place where they feel they're operating in. So like on that project with Shunt, I've never felt so out of control on anything in my life, you know, as a designer. You know, I mean, that was very exciting, actually. Just to go, normally you're in control, you're holding the drawing somehow. That's your one thing that you can hang on to. But with performance like that, we were just making things, analyzing space, watching a performance happen. And, you know, that's quite an interesting provocation, and then expecting you to respond to that somehow. So what it's done in terms of the expertise of those students is that they're now unbelievably busy with projects which are to do with architectural and engineering questions, like tunneling, for example, the whole world of civil engineering, meeting kind of archaeology, for example. So the world of archaeology and civil engineering are really hitting off each other in an interesting way right now. When you drive a tunnel through a city, like it's happening in London, that produces extraordinary information. So they are, because they've been able to visualize these things to this level of kind of richness. See, a pure engineer would say, what's the point of making it look so pretty, you know, with the ScanLab stuff? They would say the information is all you need. It's just the geometric information that all that matters. But by making it a visually kind of rich thing, I think the subject matter starts to come out. So if you go and look at ScanLab's website, there's loads of films on it, which, you know, they're experimenting with Oculus kind of lenses now, where you're immersed in a 3D scanned space, you know, and again, that is a design tool. So, you know, maybe we might, you know, quite clearly we'd have a different view to the world as designers when you can survey the space you might be working for at a much higher level of information. So in my day, when you surveyed a building site, quite common that 25% of the information would come back blank with a box and the word no access written in the center. And the surveyor could not get into that space, and then they said, therefore, I'm not taking responsibility for any information about that space. Now you can send a 3D scanner into a nuclear reactor that is you know, alive, and you can get all the 3D data you want. So I think, in a way, we're saying information now is becoming richer. How do you operate with that? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have a second part of the question, which is how do you view this clash between the performance and prototyping and designing language clashing, and how does that apply to, for example, the future of urban design, for example?
How does the clash between performance and design relate to prototyping urban design? Well, I think you can, you know, relate those things to each other, but I don't. I don't work at that scale. You know, I'm not. I think you can for certain, and the steps between. Here's another way of putting it. You know, once 3D modeling came along, the idea of a scaled drawing kind of disappeared. You know, everything is one-to-one. It's just about you just zoom in, you zoom out. That's all you're doing now. But say when I was a student, you had to decide to draw in at 1 to 50, or 1 to 20, or 1 to 1250, or 1 to 2000, or 1 to 10. You had to choose a scale to draw in, and then you went into that way of thinking. You were thinking exclusively in that scale, and you saw the drawing as the space of that scale, and you developed the information around that scale that would work best at that scale. So there are all sorts of graphic skills, but also academic skills which would exploit that scale to get across the architectural intent. But when you're working with 3D modeling, it's everything. You zoom in, you zoom out, and I think that's challenging. Actually, I don't think we've completely got our heads around that yet. And so you can work at the world of the urban and the world of designing a bolt, that holds two bits of steel together on the same model.
I think also maybe in answer to your question around the value of this work is also at the beginning of this book that this relationship between industry and academia is very difficult, and it's very hard to know what you're getting out of programs, but what they want from us is to do what they can do, which is to make mistakes, and to really dive in and trust those mistakes, and to do stupid things sometimes, or be out of control, and to be extremely precise and aware of what just happened, and what can be got out of that, and what is the potential for new things, because new things come from making mistakes. Like if you enter every process certain of the outcome, you're doomed to the present. So in the way that the body evolves in the same way that we get cancer and that cells mutate, it's up to you to dive into that and to examine what is a good mutation, what is a good mistake, and what's shifted your perception. And if you really trust yourself in that process, it gets really dirty, really messy, and really lose control. And remember to look back on it with clarity and to offer your failings forward. That's really what you can get out of it.
All right.
We're done.
Beer?
Yeah.